Okay, so teaching now, right? Teaching for me has always occupied a very, very, very central position because I think it's the only way you can formulate ideas. I'm always very, very, very clear about the fact that most of my ideas don't come from me sitting in an ivory tower as imagined those great anthropologists having their secluded office full of very neatly arranged book and they write like that. For me, it's unfortunately I think I'm ADHD a bit. It comes from the sort of the formulation of ideas and responding to questions to students. So I started teaching back in 1996 when Philippe Pelletier asked me to be a TA for the anthropology of history of Pacific arts when I started to teach anthropology. So for me, I really, I read a lot of textbook. I read also some, classical text, but that allowed me to really have a sort of very synthetic idea of those fluxes of ideas since the evolutionist, the diffusionist, the importance of the environment, and etc. And teaching for me has always been a way to sort of formulate maybe sometimes half-baked ideas, retranscribe what I understood from that, and having the student feeding back to me, asking questions, and etc. So when Philippe asked me in 2006, when I arrived at the Musée du Quai Branly to take the chair at the École du Louvre, that I followed and made me become an oceanist, right? I was a bit sort of, okay, so what I'm going to do there? So the way in which the teaching at the École du Louvre is organized, it's usually in cycle of 3 years. It's a bit like, those big chair where you talk about whatever you want for 3 years. Usually curators, that's curator who do those lectures, they organize, so you've got your specialty, French painting, peinture étrangère, sculpture, Pacific, etc., or Egyptology. And usually curators choose a theme for 3 years that's going to go with an exhibition. That's allowed them to formulate ideas, right, or to organize the material. So for me, that was, at the beginning, I didn't really understood that. For 3 years, I did a bit sort of material culture in general. So I was reading Jean-Pierre Varnier, I was reading Danny Miller, I was reading all the material culture type of things and trying to see all of that, understanding Strathern. I started to teach Strathern, the portable person, using my own material. It wasn't only about the abelam, it was about, I talk about the gift. I developed lectures also. The great thing about the École du Louvre is the fact that you're teaching to undergraduates, but you also teach to auditeurs libres, which are people who are retired, who come back to that, and they have usually a sort of cultural baggage. And so that allowed me to really clarify some ideas. And also going back to object. At the beginning, students and auditors were telling me, you don't talk enough about the object, you talk a lot about theory. So they brought me back into looking at the object. So after a couple of years where the lecture were a bit like that, I started to organize my lectures into a cycle of 3 years. So the first one, I can't remember what it was, but the last 6 years, so I taught for 14 years, right? So that makes 3 cycles. So 2 years, not really, then a cycle on makers. So I used the technique of I applied the chaîne opératoire to looking at objects, how they were made. So I went into the literature. It was amazing because I was really, really reading the ethnographic literature on Pacific arts and images. So that was really an occasion. That's the reason why teaching is so important, because you have to read the material you teach. You cannot teach out of the blue, right? And so from 2010, I started to teach my anthropology of techniques and technology here, but that wasn't Pacific material. And that's that is what is important here. Because the only way I could keep up with still being an oceanist was teaching at the École du Louvre, because I was reading Pacific materials. At the same time, I was finishing my book, which was finished in 2000, which was completely finished in 2013. I was reading the proof, editing the Bon à tirer, as my mother was dying of cancer at the moment when the farm was finished. So I started to teach on the making of image, so I look at all the literature that were talking about covers, makers, and etc. Right? I remember also being at the thesis of Hélène Guillot, who did that amazing PhD thesis on the making of Polynesian canoes. I mean, boat, fish, literally boat, right? Vessels. So I was engaging also with her around that. And the last lecture that I started to read was after thinking about and working with ideas that Philippe Descola had put in La Fabrique des Images. Because the term for me, La Fabrique, was very interesting, the making of images. So that was exactly for me. So I started to take some of the ideas and try to see, does that work? Basically what he told me, because I had the opportunity to interview him, say I put those ideas there just for people to try. And I think it was quite interesting and challenge and etc. Right? So I tried to do that. And a couple of ideas started to come. But that was the only place at the École du Louvre that I could teach that. And because here I was teaching something else. Here I arrived in a department which was the department where people starting to talk about digital anthropology, where the anthropology of consumption was very important, the anthropology of social media, which is now the biggest thing. And I was a bit sort of the oddball, because I was combining the new Melanesian ethnography of Roy Wagner, Marilyn Strader, and all those high theoretician, very post-Heideggerian type of thing, the partible person, and etc., with material culture studies, consumption, Alfred Gell. We'll talk about Alfred Gell because it was quite important. It became very important, and still for me, right? Alfred Gell and the French technologie culturelle, that is François Sigaud, Creswell, Lemonnier, les techniques, and a bit of Descola. This idea of ontological regimes. I always preferred ontological regimes than ontologies. I think it's more useful as a term. For me, that's how. So, yeah, it was a bit like trying. But then I decided okay, I need to teach here the anthropology of techniques, right? And I realized that, I remember I was at a conference, I can't remember where, quite early stage. And I was after the dinner at the conference as a sort of young scholar. And I can remember who asked me that. I think I remember now. I say, what's your specialty? So I'm doing anthropology of technology. And that person say, Foucault. And I look at them like, what? And I realized that there was a problem of language, right? That wasn't even at the time when the digital was emerging, but at the moment people were thinking about technology as a sort of I realized it wasn't really the same type of thing that I was talking about. And I realized that there was a problem there. And we can talk about that when we're going to talk about the theoretical content of my work. So I decided that I would teach the anthropology of technology, showing that technology was not what the people were saying. It wasn't Foucault, right? It wasn't necessarily the digital, but it was something else. It was something that I learned, which was basically based on Marcel Mauss. So I presented those ideas, and still do today up until last week, right, when we ended up talking about techno-populism. Still focusing on this idea of objects, right? But the thing that I want to talk about here is the ways in which teaching the anthropology of techniques took me away from, alas, my anthropology of Oceania, but taught me a lot about what's going on today, right? I'm very grateful for the École du Louvre to have kept me there, because that was the moment when I started to think about going back to the notion of objects. And interestingly enough, it's from the particular position that I had vis-a-vis my approach to objects and encounters with other scholars and other younger scholars actually were more open than the older one actually to those ideas. It really helped me to start to try to formulate not a theory particularly, but more an analytical frame that is a tool that I can use and apply to different type of objects. So I taught, Suzanne here asked me to teach the first year the Anthropology of Art and Design. So my course was half Anthropology of Art. So I taught Alfred Gels and etc. A bit of semiology, Peirce, Panofsky as well. I drew upon my knowledge in art history because at the École du Louvre we also had to read Panofsky and this type of thing and the theories. And the second part was the anthropology of technique. So I focused on the chaîne opératoire, which was, to be honest, seen as something like a bit outdated and a bit sort of formulaic for British anthropologists, because they only knew the chaîne opératoire from the work of archaeologists. And so for them, for anthropology, that wasn't really interesting, because they took it in the way in which the traditional technology culture said, that is action on material. And I was trying to demonstrate that you can apply that to other parts. That was a way of looking at processes of making, taking into account what people were putting in. And that's through that discussion, and particularly a conference in France organized by Fabienne Watteau in Nanterre, whom I also do a great debt, because at the darkest hours in Paris, she told me, like, Ludo, keep going, you're a good one. I know you don't see, but you're going to make it. This type of small sentence at the cigarette break outside of a conference, when you just it's very important to really give that type of encouragement when you really believe. And that's the moment when she organized something around the object, and I wrote that paper, one of my first paper, which is Anthropologie de l'objet, Anthropologie par l'objet, Anthropology of things, Anthropology of objects, Anthropology by objects. So I was going back to my early thinking about objects are central. That's our point of entry. And then after that, there was that other conference which was quite important, organized by, I think it was Philippe Soulier, and got to the volume edited by Nathan Schlonger and Christine Taylor, autour de Leroi-Gourhan, where I presented a paper which was the first time really where I started to put ideas together, where I talk about the chaîne opératoire as transect being an ecological thing. That was a scary moment, because I was presenting that to Jean Paulet was there, but also Éric Boueda, all the old school archaeologists that use the chaîne opératoire for lithic material. I think even Nicole Pigeot, who was in Paris 1, very amazing lithicians, people, right, which I followed the class also before, were there. So that was really terrifying to present, and say, okay, I'm going to take the chaîne opératoire and I'm going to do what you guys don't want to do. I'm including other things. And I recruited the ideas by Latour, particularly the system of recruitment, the idea of recruitment. And that's quite important. That is a process, recruit things, enroll things, right? So it's very Acriche, Madeleine Acriche, very Latour, all of that. And I presented that. I know some people weren't really keen on that, but other really saw something. And that's the paper, théorie, I can't remember, chaîne opératoire, transect et théorie. It was a very important paper there. At the same time, that's the moment when I arrived here in 2013. You've got Péric Pitrou, who was doing his postdoc here, a student of d'Escola Développing l'Anthropologie de la Vie, was sitting over there, on the other side there. And we're both French. And I remember he knocked on my door, and he sat down there and said, okay, Ludo, explain to me why I should look at the material culture. And we worked there on that whiteboard there. And that's the moment we started that conversation that's going to lead to the relationship between les processus vitaux et les processus techniques, vital processes and technical processes. Péric started his big conference in Paris on living being an artifact, être vivant et artefact, developing. And that's the moment where we really started to, fertilize one another type of ideas. So this idea that looking at technical processes was something that was very important really came from those series of encounters and encouragement, right? And I presented that to the students, and I started to ask the students to make chaîne opératoire for their assignments. Since 2010, they did amazing work with chaîne opératoire. They did like stuff that I don't know. I would like to see what the French students are doing, but they did like really amazing work on, from making a latte in a cafe in Shoreditch to coding to building a character on League of Legends to putting a tampon to, all of that, right? It was really, really, really sort of like rich. They all did those experiments and, we talked about their project and they started to produce also a series of essays engaging with Latour, with Descola, with all those elements that I brought in and imported and engaging with that, right? Even, comparing the thick description of Clifford Geertz with the chaîne opératoire, demonstrating that the chaîne opératoire is not a skeleton key, but it's a tool that you put in your toolbox that you need to complement with other things. That's also the moment that I realized I started to engage with, rather, he engaged critically with my work by saying that the chaîne opératoire, that was very wrong what I did. Tim Ingold started to criticize what I'd done with the yam, making it an artifact instead of looking at that growing. Mm-hmm. So I started to teach, but, with a sort of, I tried to be as open as possible with sort of critical position. So, for example, the ontological regime of Descola were very interesting, but for me, the most important chapter for me was Les schèmes de la pratique, schema of practices, because it goes back to Audricourt, which was very important for me. So physicality, interiority were there. So we talked about that in lectures, in stuff, and that sort of really helped me, and I hope helped some of the students who went on and did PhD with me to start to build on that sort of, not one chapel. I didn't have one theory, but I wanted to build an analytical frame around techniques, while still keeping an idea from object. And the point of encounter from my teaching on object, the last series of 3 years lecture that I gave at the École du Louvre was because Philippe Pelletier and Christian Kaufmann made that very big exhibition in France on the CEPIC. And they told me, Philippe sent me that very nice message saying, Ludo, we're not including Abelard material, we're not including you because they're not really on the CEPIC and we've got too much. But we've got something for you afterwards. The exhibition comes out and they publish a special issue of the Journal of the Sociétés des Océanistes, and I write another paper, which for me is very important, which I had to fight a bit to have it in English because I wanted to be available to the English audience as the French. Philippe and Christian told me, okay, write on CEPIC images using what the Abelam have taught you. Whoa. So I went back to, again, Friendship Network, to 2 friends who live in Saumur, next to Saumur, in Montreuil-Bellay. She's a painter and he's a comedian, right? And that's my writing retreat, my residence. Philippe and Stephanie. So I go there with books and I look at images, the CEPIC images, and I started to read and etc. And I realized that I've got something there quite interesting, looking at the anthropomorphic figures as a machine, to go very quickly, as an object which is supposed to have a particular role in a ritual. But how does it function? It functions because it uses the property of the human body. It's not a representation of the human body, but it used the property. We'll go back to that later in the more theoretical. So I read that paper and I sent it to Philippe and Christian, and I'm really scared because, I'm taking risks there. I'm talking about material that I've done research. And both Christian and Philippe tell me, you got something there. So I decided to teach 3 years. At the same time, I'm invited in Brasilia, by Carlos Sauchuk, who is in University of Brasilia, who is very familiar with the French anthropology of techniques, and invite me for 1-week workshop. Still make fun of that because he took me to that beautiful resort, but I spent locked up for 5 days. I didn't see any of Brazil. I just was amazing, very rich. Encountered Guilherme Moura Facundes and Eduardo Dideus and Carlos. And Carlos told me, Ludo, you need to read Simondon. I say, another philosopher, please no. I love reading philosophy, but I hate anthropologists I don't like when anthropologists pretend to be philosopher. Do you see what I mean? Unfortunately, I think that philosophy is a discipline. It has its, you need to be trained. I'm not trained in philosophy. I read philosophy. Unfortunately for us, philosophers have the capacity to move to anthropology and do very good anthropology. But for me, okay, another philosopher. Okay, right, okay. Read Simondon. When it comes to the diode and cathode on page 35, the book drops. Then our first daughter is born, our second son is about to come, and then Carlos comes again. We try to do a couple of things together. I say, please try to read it. Okay, so I go to a cafe, cigarette, coffee, sit down, and I start to read. And then I realize that the cathode and the anode that Simondon is talking about are actually the ancestors of processes. That ticks. And then I go, and then I read, and then I started to get. And I realized that there is something that both the new Melanesian ethnography, talking about the individual personhood, the Bergsonian sort of trend, and Simondon and Leroi-Gourhan works together. I start to reach Stigler, and there is something there that starts to coalesce together. And that's the moment I started to teach. I understand that my course on the anthropology of techniques, I need to decompose technology into 3 different points of entry, which is today, which is on the one hand, technical activity, which chaîne opératoire, merging with matière à penser. So there was a debate between matière à penser and la technologie culturelle. I don't care. I'm just merging all together. Some part of the Marxist tradition in England. So I know about how to document on, technical processes. I can do chaîne opératoire now very well. Then I started to go back to my first interest, technical objects. And then, Simondon, Leroi-Gourhan. But I realized then that technical is not so much, technical is an adjective. It not exhausts what an object is. So a human figure in a ritual is an aesthetic object, but it's also a technical object as it is part of a technical activity, which is the ritual. So the ritual, and that's the one I use most. Most said, ritual act in the prayer are acts that are efficacious for the actor and traditional, learned and transmitted. He says later, 30 years later, technical act is an act which is efficacious and traditional. It's the same thing as ritual. So I realized that, all that idea of ritual and techniques goes together. And then the merging between my interest for object and my interest for techniques start to merge. So technical activity, I've got tools now to start to think about technical object. And the last part, and that's going to come with the development of the digital, but also my work on garden, is the technical milieu, the relation with the environment. So we go back to that triad that Sander van der Leu, back in 95, put in that small seminar where he put society, nature, technology. You see? We've got the technical activity, the technical objects, and there. And that's where I am now.